I don't think of America as a melting pot. I think of America as a mosaic. I find that Americans are very interested in hanging on to their cultural roots. You know, like German Americans will have an Oktoberfest. You know, Irish Americans, St. Patrick's Day. You know, there is an inherent need for Americans to hang on to their cultural roots. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I do sometimes feel that that's something that can be weaponized. And rather than people looking at each other and seeing that we're all Americans, there are people in this country that think they're more American than others. And I got into a discussion with somebody about that, saying that they were saying that, you know, generationally they're Americans because their parents have been here for generations, as opposed to, say, maybe my children, who would be considered first generation Americans. And my point to them was that your claim to be American is no less profound than somebody who's a first generation American. And unless you're Native American, as far as I'm concerned, your claim to being American is no greater than somebody whose parents go back one generation.
And you spoke about your children. What do you think their status and position is within that mosaic then?
I'm not really sure. I don't think their sensibilities, I think, are probably like mine. In terms of, I don't think they think of themselves as what people would think of as typically American. Again, I think that when you are the children of immigrants, I think your worldview and how you perceive yourself within the American social structure is going to be different. And especially if you're black or brown, I think even more so, because this country has racism as part of its DNA. It's founded on the blood, sweat and tears of people of color. So that's the dynamic for my children will be very different from somebody who has come from a very Eurocentric background in terms of, you know, generationally. And I think it's been interesting for my children because once, you know, African Americans know that they're not, you know, typically they're atypical because their parents are from England and their grandparents are from Jamaica. It's been interesting that once, I know, like my son, for example, once he met this guy and the guy said to him, "Oh, you know, where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Florida." And he goes, "Oh, you know, where's your family from?" And once he said, "My family's from Jamaica and England," the guy was like, "Oh yeah, you're not really African American." So that's kind of interesting that their perception of my son was, because he was culturally different, then he was not considered African American. And I don't think my children think of themselves as African American. They just think of themselves as black in America.
And I found it interesting that the label you apply to yourself as an immigrant, do you think that in itself is an identity? So your parents immigrated from Jamaica to England and you immigrated from England to America. Do you think that is part of the legacy that you leave? Do you think your children would immigrate themselves?
I don't know, but it's definitely part of their DNA. Interestingly, I'm not sure if they would. I don't think that they would rule it out. I know that my daughter has even talked about maybe living in the UK. So I don't think they would rule it out. I think there are some benefits to feeling countryless, which is sometimes how I feel. I don't particularly feel tied to any particular country. I love Jamaica because that's where my parents are from. So those are the roots. You know, I love England because that's where I was raised. In my formative years, my sensibilities, you know, lend themselves to that. I love certain aspects of the US because this is where I've made a life with my husband, my children were born here, and what have you. So I've taken a little bit from each country, if you will.
Yeah.
But if I had to say I had a strong affiliation or affinity to any one of those countries, I can't say that it's particularly strong.
Yeah.
That's why I say I am my country. You know, each place has helped to mold me or shape me or given me certain experiences, but I don't, for somebody, say, for example, that has a very strong connection to their country because that's all they've known, you know, and, you know, I think about Katya, you know, she's Russian, she's very proud of her country, and her sensibilities that clearly, you know, I don't know what it feels like to have that kind of pride, because I'm not Jamaican, and Jamaican wouldn't consider me a Jamaican. They would feel an affiliation to me because my parents are Jamaican. I'm not typically British since that's where I was born, but growing up, I wasn't made to feel particularly welcome in some respects. I'm not saying that my upbringing was horrendous in the UK and that, you know, all of my experiences were negative, but it was always tinged with, where are you from? When clearly you're talking to a child. I remember having those conversations with people, I'm a child, why would you assume that I'm not from here? Well, you're assuming I'm not from here because I'm black, but this is where I was born. So I can't feel this overwhelming sense of I'm British because I wasn't made to feel completely welcome as somebody who's British.
And my final question is then, do you think that more people in future will bear the same ideas that you bear, especially in America? The idea that you're American, but you're not American above any other identity. So it's not and or, it's kind of like duality.
I think that a duality will always exist. I don't know. I mean, I can only speak for myself. I find it interesting that Americans call themselves Americans, but there's always a caveat with the African American, German American, Italian American.
Yeah.
I always found that very strange here for a country that celebrates immigrants. That, okay, if you're all one big melting pot, which you're not, a melting pot wouldn't say African American, Italian American, German American, Irish American. You just be American. That's a melting pot. When you look at somebody or you lay claim to your country, and you no longer have the caveat of linking it to the country from which your ancestors are from. That's when you're a melting pot. If you keep calling yourself African American, or people label you as African American, or label you as Italian American or German American, then you're a mosaic. You're part of a mosaic to create one big picture, which is not a melting pot. That's just my humble opinion.
Great, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me.
All right, you're more than welcome.